Today's video is about a movie called Joe Bell. Watch out with spoilers ahead. May 2013. Joe Bell calls his wife on the phone as he walks down the highway and leaves her a message checking in. A bus nearly hits him, and his son Jaden chastises him. Joe arrives at a high school, where he gives a presentation to the students about tolerance. He tells the students about how bullying and how harmful it is while Jaden watches from the back of the auditorium. Joe says understanding begins at home, and as long as that happens everything will be alright. Afterward, Joe and Jaden set up a campsite along the highway to sleep for the night. Jaden criticizes him for his speech the night before being a lie. Flashback to La Grande, Oregon, 9 months earlier. Jaden tells his dad that he's being picked on by boys at school because he's different. His father pushes him on why, and Jaden says it's because he's gay. Joe tells him he taught him how to box and he should know how to defend himself. He then tells Jaden to let nature take its course and it will work itself out. His wife Lola tells him that it won't, and assures Jaden that they love him. Joe leaves in a huff and Lola hugs Jaden. Later, Jaden overhears Joe saying that maybe it's just a phase. Joe sees Jaden practicing cheerleading in the front yard. His parents let him join the squad. Embarrassed, Joe goes out and tells Jaden to practice in the backyard. When Jaden asks why, Joe tells him to shut the fuck up and do as he's told. Later, Joe goes to Jaden's room and tells him he's going to try to be better and tells him he loves him. Back in the present, Joe and Jaden continue to walk the highway in Idaho. Joe and Jaden argue about which is better, La Grande or New York City. Jaden argues that New York has Lady Gaga, and begins singing Born This Way, and Joe surprises Jaden by singing along, admitting he knows the words. Joe and Jaden stop in a diner to eat, where the waitress notes she's seen him on TV. The news on the TV mentions same-sex marriage, and a bar patron insults it and calls it fairy shit. Joe goes to him and tells him he's on a walk for his son Jaden and gives him a card for his walk for inclusion. Joe leaves and Jaden tells him that is barely going to change those men. Jaden says the people at his talks aren't the issue, it's men like that and their kids. Jaden says Joe told him he needed to fight, but Joe is just handing out cards and walking away. Back in flashbacks. At school, Jaden continues to be bullied by the football players, but one football player, Chance, makes lingering eye contact with him in the lunchroom. At a Halloween party, the boy invites Jaden to smoke with him and they end up kissing. At the football game, Jaden performs with the cheerleading squad, but he is mocked and harassed by some of the members of the crowd. Joe, embarrassed, takes Lola by the hand and leaves the stands. Later, Jaden receives harassing and bullying comments on social media. His little brother Joseph comforts him. Back on the road, Joe tells Jaden he was supportive of him and Jaden points out he only came to one game and walked away during it, but Joe says he was afraid for him. Joe calls Lola at a rest stop. Lola is a little drunk and Joe criticizes her drinking, and she points out that he isn't there and has no idea what's going on. That night camped out, Joe cooks for him and Jaden and it begins raining. Jaden begins cheering in the rain, eventually coaxing Joe into doing it with him. Back in flashbacks, Jaden and Chance talk about what they want to do with their lives. Jaden wonders if they could go to New York together and Chance tells Jaden he might be aiming too high. In present day, Joe and Jaden arrive in Salt Lake City. Joe preps to go to a gay bar, and Jaden teases him about being nervous a guy might hit on him, but then reassures him it'll be okay. He tells him he wishes he could go with him and wishes Joe good luck with a hug. At the gay bar, Joe meets with some patrons who tell him about their experiences growing up gay. A drag queen comes up and asks Joe what he's doing there, and one of the locals explains Joe is walking across the country to promote anti-bullying and support of his son. The drag queen asks why he didn't bring his son, and Joe tells her that his son is dead. He returns to his motel room, where Jaden is no longer, since the Jaden on the walk has been a figment of Joe's mind. At his next motel stop, Joe calls Lola and Joseph. Joseph asks about him and Lola coming to visit Joe on the journey, an idea Joe supports. Later, they arrive for their visit and go to see a local rodeo show. At their hotel, a couple recognizes Joe from his walking across America and asks for a picture with him. Later, Lola gives Joe a note that was left at Jaden's grave by one of his bullies indicating he wants to apologize. Joe is furious, yelling at Lola and Joseph and saying there is no forgiveness for the kids who bullied Jaden. He continues berating them until Joseph screams at him to stop. The next day, Lola confronts Joe about being on a forgiveness walk and says she's supported him with his walk but he's going to lose her and Joseph if he keeps having these outbursts. She tells him not to come home until he's figured out what he's doing out there. She wonders if he's walking for celebrity or walking for Jaden. She says if he's really walking for Jaden, Jaden will let him know when it's time to come home. Joe continues his walk, and continues giving speeches and talks and interviews, ending up on various news programs. Later, Lola calls Joe and tells Joe that she found an essay that Jaden wrote. She reads it to Joe, and it is all about feeling different and bullied and how badly he wants it to be over. In flashbacks, Jaden is grabbed and assaulted by a group of boys in the locker room. He and his parents meet with a school administrator, who advises Jaden to perhaps transfer schools or go to therapy. She counsels them not to file charges against the boys who did this. The boys continue to harass Jaden across social media. Jaden calls one of his friends who is on the way with her mom to visit someone out of town. Jaden says he can't go home and begs them to pick him up, but his friend's mom doesn't want to and says they're too far out of town despite his friend pleading with her. His friend promises to come see him first thing when they come back. Lola finds Jaden's suicide note as a jogger comes across Jaden's body, having hung himself. Lola, desperate to have it not be true, drives to the scene but sobs when she sees she is too late. The Bell family mourns Jaden's loss. Joe sits out in the car with a gun, and Joseph enters and asks him what he's doing, but Joe orders him to go back inside. Joe goes to a park and sobs. The next day, he tells Lola he's decided to walk across America to New York City. He says he wants to tell everyone about bullying and about what happened, and that he's doing it for Jaden. Lola isn't sure where he'll get the money. In the present, Joe calls Lola and tearfully tells her he isn't sure he can keep going and wants to go home. Lola reminds him he's doing it for Jaden. He tells Lola he saw Jaden and he's been leading him, but now he's disappeared. Later on, as he walks down the highway, someone who has heard about his story pulls over beside him and provides him with supplies and food. Sheriff Weston pulls over to investigate the man on the road, and Joe explains his story to him. Derry brings Joe in for a hot meal and sets up a speaking engagement at the high school for him. Joe sees pictures of Weston's son in his home. Weston tells Joe his son is gay, and they share their experiences with their sons. Joe tells him what he has learned is that he was too caught up in his own feelings to see how his son felt. He made it all about himself. Weston tells him he didn't consider until now that his son might have considered taking his own life, and that he doesn't think he could have gone on if he had. Joe tells him he never let Jaden know it was okay and he has to live with that, and urges Weston not to make the same mistake. Joe goes to give his talk and sees Jaden sitting in the stands with the other students. Joe continues walking and once again sees Jaden. Joe tells Jaden how sorry he is, and Jaden tells him he always knew that Joe loved him, he was just in a lot of pain. Jaden tells Joe he loves him, and Joe cries and says he knows. Joe calls Lola and leaves a message telling them he loves them and thanking them for putting up with him. He says he's learned a lot on the road and promises to be better about staying in touch. Weston gets a call about an accident and arrives at the scene where a truck has collided with a pedestrian, Joe, killing him. Weston sees Joe's body and tells him to hurry to Jaden. Joe walks through a field where he finds Jaden.